So for coming, I will keep my intro brief as always. Today we're honored to have Professor Jeremy Kidd from Mercer with us, and he's going to tell us about economics and Uber and fun stuff like that. So I'll get out of the way and turn it over to Jeremy.
So I am excited to be here. I know excited is not a term that most people use when economics is on the screen. I do promise that during my talk I will try and keep the discussion of economics to the minimum necessary to understand the principles, but we'll spend most of our time today talking about the law and why Uber and ride sharing and innovation is important for us as students and teachers of the law. I'll start with a discussion of the history of the point-to-point transportation market, of which Uber and taxis both form a part. Then we'll spend some time talking about the factors that I think regulators and lawmakers should consider as they decide how to respond to innovation in this market and others. Spend a little bit of time talking about some groups that might have ulterior motives that might be influencing the debate, but not openly doing so. And then finally, a discussion of the lessons we might draw from ride-sharing as an analogy. I debated using a really bad kind of dad joke pun for the presentation, calling it Innovation Uber Allegory. But we won't. But I decided not to because that was really bad. Anyway, so we'll get started. So there's pretty much always been a need for help to get from point A to point B. Either to get us to the stuff we want or to get the stuff we want to us. And for most of human history, that's meant animals and some sort of wheeled vehicle. And that continued up into the turn of the 20th century. And at that point, three things happened that sort of changed the game. One was that population density began to rise dramatically in most major cities, which increased the need for point-to-point transportation, but also decreased the ability of people to own their own form of transportation. The second was the invention of the automobile, obviously, which heralded a shift from horse-drawn hansom cabs to auto cabs. And the third was the rapid decrease in the cost of buying your own automobile due to mass production techniques. And that led to basically an overcorrection. We ended up with, everyone decided to get into the auto cab industry, and we ended up with a lot of cabs on the streets in most major cities. In an era before CB radios and GPS, it's obviously very difficult, very costly for riders to find taxis, taxis to find riders. In the words of Ronald Coase, the transaction costs were so high that market transactions by themselves couldn't be expected to necessarily reach an efficient and functioning outcome. And so a non-market solution was proposed and adopted, and that was the medallion system. The medallion system sets a fixed limit on the number of taxi cabs that can operate within city limits. It restricts supply, and as a result, individual cabbies can now make a much better living. But it also insulates them from competition. And because it insulates them from competition, they can collect what economists refer to as monopoly rents. These are excess profits. And they're not profits that come because someone has found a way to reduce their cost of production. It's not because they have innovated a new product that people are willing to pay a premium for. These are profits that are derived solely because the government has intervened in the market and said, you don't have to worry about competition. We'll give you pricing power that, not quite a monopolist in this case, there's still lots of cabbies, but monopoly-like power. Over time, transaction costs came down as technology advanced, and yet the barriers remained in place. In large part because those that were enjoying those excess profits weren't very keen on the idea of giving them up. But as time continued to pass and innovations continued to occur in technology, eventually ride-sharing companies were able to jump outside the bounds of the existing regulations and offer a reduction in transaction costs to both riders and drivers, essentially solving the problem that gave rise to the existence of the taxi industry in the first place. But there was pushback, as you might expect, both from those who stood to lose if the barriers to competition went away, all those who were collecting those monopoly rents, but also from those who had some legitimate concerns about the nature of innovation, the nature of ride-sharing. Economist Bruce Yandel, I just like mentioning this because I like the name of the theory, it's the bootlegger and Baptist theory, where you have a coalition of moralizers and profit seekers operating together to seek a particular outcome. And in this case, we seem to have that. Currently, it looks like ride sharing is winning the day. Of course, the story hasn't been fully written, and lawmakers and regulators are going to have to make some choices about how we deal with innovation in ride sharing and other areas of the economy. So the factors that we probably ought to consider, obviously the effect on consumers, and we'll get to the potential concerns because it's a fairly long list, so I'll fit on that. But we have benefits to consumers, we have the potential concerns that have been raised, and then I think we need to also consider the ulterior motives of some of those that are working behind the scenes, the bootleggers in the bootlegger and Baptist theory. So when it comes to consumers, the benefits are relatively straightforward. Because there is no, consumers, riders in particular, in a large city are no longer constrained in their transportation options. They can obtain transportation more rapidly. They can obtain it usually at a lower cost. They can obtain it more conveniently in that they don't have to have a credit card or cash with them. And because they are tracked in real time, they can often obtain it in a much safer form as well. Drivers have the advantage of being able to gain really flexible employment that can fill in the gaps that their normal employment has left them. For many of them, it is their first opportunity to afford an automobile of their own or to afford a reliable automobile, which actually has some spillover benefits for their neighborhoods and their communities. So these are benefits that ought to be considered, but that's not the only thing we need to consider. There are potential costs, potential concerns with ride sharing. There are some that are perhaps less helpful. We have statements made by opponents to ride sharing. This obviously falls into the not helpful category of debate, but even some of the more scholarly debates fall into some of the same traps of caricature, of exaggeration of the cost, of minimization of the benefits. So, we get to the real list. So this is a list of concerns that are derived from the potential impact of ride sharing on individuals. And they fall into two basic categories. One are concerns that are general, or that are important but general, in that if true, they're troubling, but they are also applicable to the existing industry. For example, discrimination has been found to be is a problem in ride sharing, but it is found to be as prevalent or potentially even more prevalent in the taxi industry. Right? So these are concerns that are real, but they're not specific to the ride-sharing industry, and they shouldn't be used as an obstacle to innovation. I mean, by all means, if we have problems, we ought to be looking to fix them. But to use these concerns as a barrier to innovation, it doesn't do anything to help marginalized communities, but what it does do is it hurts all consumers. Marginalized communities tend to be those that are most hurt by these types of regulations. The second type of concern with regard to individuals are important but technology specific in that the advances in technology may have made these concerns more salient. Whether it's manipulation of riders or exploitation of drivers, these are concerns that are always with us, but technology as it advances may have strengthened the hand of technology providers or of other sellers. Now, for both types of concerns, at least for now, the state of the empirical evidence is quite weak. And given the competitive nature of the industry, and particularly given the lack of competition in the industry that is being disrupted, the taxi industry, there are good reasons to suspect that innovation has not, in fact, made things worse. Okay? If regulation is needed, it should be targeted, it should be specific, but it is worth at least considering that regulation may just play into the hands of those who would like the government to keep interfering with competition so that the entrenched incumbents don't have to work for their profits. They can continue to collect additional profits without having to actually provide something extra of value to consumers. So, then we have a set of concerns that go beyond the impact on any individual, because these raise questions about the nature of innovation and how we and others who are involved in the law should think of innovation, should address innovation as we move forward. First of all, the rule of law requires adherence to existing regulations, but only insofar as those regulations actually apply. And in an industry with high barriers to entry, the incentive is to innovate completely outside the bounds of existing regulation. So it is possible that what we have is an innovation that has simply left the regulations behind, that the existing regulations do not apply to whatever the new innovation is. So that's something we need to keep in mind whenever it comes to innovation. We also, as a society, and this is kind of a tangential point, but we also as a society need to decide whether we want the default rule to be that all that is not expressly permitted is prohibited, in an FDA rule. You need permission before you can do it. Or whether we want a default rule that says all that is not expressly prohibited is permitted. So is the default rule that go ahead and innovate, or is the default rule come to us and we'll let you know whether you can or not? That's just something that we as a society need to decide. Regulation is, by its nature, slow, but if markets are functioning properly, we may find that, given the time that it takes to regulate, we may find that we don't need regulation because it may be that the problems that we envision occurring in an industry like ride-sharing work themselves out over time, especially if, as I mentioned earlier, the transaction costs have come down, and now we can have a little bit more faith in the ability of market transactions to take care of this. The second concern has to do with information asymmetries. The existence of information asymmetries can keep effective and efficient markets from both forming and functioning. The current concern is that ride-sharing companies gather a lot of data about us, and that with that data they can manipulate us into purchasing more of their services than we otherwise would. But there's two problems with this way of thinking. The first is that what we're talking about here is not actually an information asymmetry. And the second is that there's reasons to suspect that this type of exploitation would not occur in a competitive market. Information asymmetries exist, as a general rule, when one party needs to know but cannot know information that belongs solely to the other party. Now, principal agent problems are one example. The market for lemons is another of information asymmetries. But in this case, the informational advantage that ride-sharing companies have is that they have aggregated data that is already available to us. It's our movement patterns. It's our spending habits, after all, that they are aggregating. So the process of aggregation, rather than being a bad thing, is actually a service that we pay them for voluntarily. It's not the typical type of information asymmetry that we're concerned about. And while all companies would love for us to spend more of our limited resources on their goods and services, that need not mean that we are naive or easily manipulated, or that the companies are acting merely out of greed or cynicism. That's the view that John Kenneth Galbraith took, but you have a competing view in Adam Smith, who had a much higher estimation of both human virtue and human intelligence. And so we have to decide whether we view the world through a Galbraithian lens or whether we view it through a Smithian lens. So companies will, of course, try to discover what it is that we want. They provide it to us for sale, but they are doing that because it is what we want, right? And the Smithian view is that consumer preferences drive the market rather than the Galbraithian view, which is that creation of goods create its own demand. And if you've read the Affluent Society, anyone here read the Affluent Society? Couple? All right. Okay. We can talk about that later if you want. It's an interesting world. Anyway, so the benefits to ride sharing are fairly straightforward. They are relatively immediate and they are concrete. The costs seem to be general, merely probable as opposed to certain, and largely avoidable. And yet, they tend to get shouted louder than the benefits. And why is that? And it's possible that we have individuals with ulterior motives, Brusciandals, bootleggers, people who have incentives, financial incentives to maintain the status quo. Obviously, taxi drivers have an incentive, have a financial stake in the outcome of this fight, as do taxi companies, and taxi commissions at the city and county level. But probably least intuitive is the bottom entity, the financial institutions. Financial institutions who hold the debt on medallions and other fixed costs of entry into the taxi market. And one way to think of who the real bootleggers are, who has the real financial stake, is to propose a hypothetical. What happens if ride-sharing wins tomorrow? Well, taxi drivers will obviously be out of a job. And yet taxi drivers also possess a significant amount of very valuable human capital that would make them able to earn a living in a ride-sharing scenario. There's some data that taxi drivers who are currently forced to rent their medallions by the day, this happens a lot in Boston in particular, they have to rent their medallion for the day. They actually do better currently by switching to a ride-sharing employment scenario. So taxi drivers, probably not the strongest bootleggers because they have capacity for employment even after the innovation wins. Taxi companies, they would certainly see their business model damaged, if not completely destroyed. And yet, taxi companies also have a very large stash of valuable physical capital that could be put to use in a ride-sharing scenario. There's nothing that would keep taxi companies from implementing ride-share technology to operate their fleets, to innovate. And as long as they were freed up, this was brought up in the discussion this morning, I probably should mention it. Part of the problem is the taxi companies are still bound by the restrictive regulations. And so taxi companies currently, if they lose their protected status, they will be harmed. But part of that is because they are currently bound down by an enormous amount of restrictive regulations. And they are right to complain that ride-sharing companies are not bound by those same regulations. Okay? But that's only half the question, right? The second half of the question is, well, then what's the right solution? Do we remove the regulations from the taxi companies and let them compete? Or do we impose those same burdensome regulations on ride-sharing companies? And you probably know by now what I think the proper solution is to that. Now, down at the bottom, so taxi commissions, obviously, if they lose control of the point-to-point transportation market, that's some amount of political power that they lose. The best example of a taxi commission is the New York City Taxi Commission, which has 600 employees scattered throughout various important offices in city government. It is one of the most powerful but not unknown, but people don't realize just how intertwined it is with all the rest. If ride-sharing wins tomorrow, the New York Taxi Commission will lose some significant political power and the lobbying efforts that go toward that. It's nice to be lobbied. It's nice to be taken out to lunch, right? That might be seen minor, but there is some amount that they would lose. But then again, government agencies are remarkably resilient, and I have no doubt that taxi commissions would be put to use regulating the transportation market in some other way. And now we look down at the financial institutions at the bottom. So they hold the debt for medallions and other costs of entry into the market. Ride-sharing allows consumers to escape the closed system that exists with the taxi industry. That reduces the profits that medallion owners can collect, which reduces the amount of money that those medallion owners have to send to their banks. Most medallions are actually pretty highly leveraged. So what would we expect to happen is ride-sharing companies increase their market share. But we would expect for foreclosures on medallions to go up. And sure enough, that's what we see. So this is only from, this is about when the foreclosures started to rise. But you can see that foreclosures rise from the start of 2017 and have a general upward trend, while we have a downward trend in the price of medallions. This doesn't capture, there's been a long decline in the price of medallions. As you track in 2013, medallions in New York City reached a peak of $1.5 million each. Recent sales have had it down below $200,000 a piece. Right? That shows an indication that there's a pool of monopoly rents that's being drained as the barriers to entry begin to fail. And that has a significant impact on the bottom line of those financial institutions. So we also conducted, and I apologize for regression results. I know no one likes them, but since they're in the paper, I thought I'd put them up and go over them quickly. I'd be glad to go over these in more detail later on. I know it's always a mess when you throw them up on the screen. For what it's worth, we have very limited data. We have 40 observations for the first two regressions and only 16 for the last one. The first two are measures of regulatory environment, with a higher value being more favorable to ride-sharing companies. What we found was that if you look at Taxi Fix, that was whether or not they had a medallion system, there is a significant negative correlation, highly significant negative correlation between the regulatory environment and the existence of a medallion system, which is again circumstantial, but it's pretty strong circumstantial evidence that there is a pool of monopoly rents being protected. However, there is only minimal evidence of bootlegger activity by taxi drivers. There's no evidence of bootlegger activity by taxi companies, and no evidence of bootlegger activity by taxi commissions, which was disappointing for us. We also discovered, really disappointing for us, is that the impact of the financial sector in these cities was positive on the regulatory environment. Not entirely sure why that is, because the indexes we used as our dependent variable are black box, and the folks who put the indexes together refused to share the data. So we're hoping to get that eventually, and we have other places we're looking for additional data. So this is still a work in progress. But at least for those first two, we show the existence of a pool of monopoly rents, but very little evidence of bootlegger activity. Our third column is Uber drivers per 1,000. This is even less data because Uber isn't really keen on sharing much information now that they're being sued by everyone and their dog. And so we were only able to find data for 16 cities because those were used in a paper that they published, and since they published it, they felt compelled to share their data with others. What we found there was, one thing was fairly uninteresting, but kind of intuitive, that as population density increases the demand for Ubers, but also increases it for taxi drivers. That's what this area right here is. And doesn't reach the normal thresholds of statistical significance, but there's at least preliminary evidence of bootlegger activity by the financial market. That in those cities where the investment, kind of parse out different variables, but the influence of the investment community in a given city, as that is higher, the number of Ubers per 1,000 was lower. Again, not significant yet, but that may just be a result of low levels of observations. We're hoping to get some more data in the next couple of months and run these again. Now we have a second table. You might be wondering what that is. We decided we wanted to try the regressions without New York City because New York City was a significant outlier. And it turns out that the signs and the coefficients remain the same, and the test for statistical significance remain the same. But you may wonder, well, why did you feel the need to take New York out? Because it was an extreme outlier. In particular, population density in New York, for those of you, I imagine we've all been to New York at one point, population density in New York City is quite high. 32 standard deviations above the mean, and that's the mean of other large cities. So it is by far the most dense city in the US, which should mean a dramatic level of demand for both taxis and for Ubers. And yet, number of Uber drivers per 1,000 population in the city of New York was 4 standard deviations below. So an extreme outlier above on population density, an extreme outlier below on number of Ubers per 1,000, and the influence of the financial industry in New York City is also, across all of the measures that we tested, was 20 to 30 standard deviations above the mean. So it may be that all we're finding here, I mentioned this only to point out that it may be that all we're finding here is the effect of New York City, and that New York City is where the bootleggers are active and they're not terribly active elsewhere. It's possible we need more data. So, apologize for running you all through my regression results, but since it's in the paper, I felt it was important to mention. So, as a general rule, having that be our data, what can we learn from this as an allegory for innovation generally? Well, those sectors most susceptible to disruption are those sectors most protected by government regulation. The regulations are often intended to correct perceived or real market failures, but they also curb competition and create excess profits or rents, and those rents create an incentive for the invested parties to fight any change in the regulations. Innovations can bypass those barriers to competition and make consumers better off, but the entrenched incumbents fight them, and it ends up with this bootlegger and Baptist coalition, people who have legitimate, if sometimes overblown concerns over the nature of innovation and its impact on society and individuals, they are teamed up with those that have financial incentives to fight innovation as well. And identifying those bootleggers is important because innovation, as a general rule, tends to benefit consumers. And we should be in favor of benefiting consumers as long as the costs are less than the benefits that we derive. But those that have ulterior motives have an incentive to exaggerate the costs. And so we need to identify those that stand to gain financially from the existing regulations so that we can correctly discount their arguments, or at least look closely at the arguments that they make. At the end of the day, even if we are skeptical of markets, we should also be skeptical of opposition to innovation, because that opposition might be guided by ulterior motives that harm consumers. And innovation might not rectify past injustices, exploitation, and discrimination, but it can break down the barriers to competition that have allowed the entrenched incumbents to get away with injustice, exploitation, and discrimination in the past. Those individuals, not everyone who's protected by barriers to entry is an awful human being, but those barriers to entry do give them power that they can exploit to harm others, and they've benefited financially from it all along, and they will continue to exert that economic power in order to oppose innovation that benefits all of us. So where do we go from here? What are some potential extensions of this research? We've started already in the area of fintech. Fintech can break the stranglehold of financial institutions for all of us as consumers of financial products. We have automated management algorithms that are being implemented in corporate governance that could reduce abuses by boards of directors, but also limit the control exerted by minority activist shareholders. Innovation like crowdfunding could eliminate the stranglehold that large investment banks have over the IPO market. And then down at the bottom, so if it is true that, that those sectors most subject to disruption are those sectors most protected by government regulation, well, we should all be looking at ourselves, because that does, to a certain extent, describe us. And so it is worth considering how reductions in transaction costs could disrupt our industry, and make some plans for the future so that we are well prepared. We are not in a situation of taxi companies and taxi drivers or financial institutions left in a lurch when transactions costs finally come down far enough for people to get around the ABA barriers and other accreditation barriers. So that's my talk, and I welcome all questions anyone might have. Yeah.
So I do health law, and I'm just wondering if you could talk more about the effect on drivers, because I think drivers for Uber and Lyft and so on don't get benefits, don't get health insurance, don't get a lot of the protections that we would want for workers. So how does that play into your calculus?
Yeah, and they don't currently, right? But remember that, and this, if I can, I will get to your question, but
Sure.
Just as a setup. So one of the ways that taxi companies might be relevant in a ride-sharing scenario is similar to, maybe you're going to be familiar with energy markets, that you need a base load to run the lights like most of the time during the day. And only in times when everyone turns on their air conditioners, or everyone turns on their heaters, or everyone turns on their computers, do you need what's called peak power. So you need both in order to have a fully functioning energy market. And I think ride-sharing will probably end up looking something like the energy market, where you have taxi companies with this big stash of physical capital that can, once they're freed from the regulations, they will probably provide most of the base power. Now the question is whether or not, so their drivers currently usually get those benefits. I don't know necessarily why they would necessarily lose those benefits if I'm right about taxi companies providing the base load, and that would enable a lot of the drivers. Maybe it would actually pull some of the drivers from just pure ride sharing, Uber and Lyft, back into that market. They're inhibited currently in their ability to earn profits because of the heavy regulations that they bear, which makes it difficult for them to compete against Uber and Lyft, and it makes us. There's at least the legitimate concern that, well, they're not going to offer benefits either because Uber and Lyft don't. But benefits are something that drivers want, right? Some Uber drivers aren't willing to, are willing to do without benefits because they have benefits with their other jobs. Right? Their other jobs provide benefits, they drive Uber just to fill in the gaps. But if you don't have benefits, you might be willing to take slightly lower pay in order to get those benefits. Right? So I think the market will probably work those things out, and if not, right, we have regulations, the Affordable Care Act has mandated.
Individual mandate is gone.
Well, the individual mandate is gone, but their mandate's still on employers, right, for providing insurance. So if there are taxi companies that have more than, I can't remember the number, not my field, but the number of employees, they may end up 29 hours per week, and they might play all the games that everyone else does. But that seems to me to be a question of tweaking the regulations for health insurance generally. Doesn't seem to be a concern, particularly with ride sharing.
So, you're focused on point-to-point transportation.
Yeah.
I apologize, I only had time to skim your paper, so you may have a full discussion of this. But it seems to me there's another issue involved, and that is the effect of this on public transportation.
Yeah, and they're actually, I don't spend a lot of time in the paper.
So if you did, I'm just curious, one argument in favor of, say, restrictive taxi markets might be that it forces people or encourages people, gives them an incentive to use public transportation, which from a social standpoint might be better than any point-to-point transportation.
Yeah, it might be, and I think that's...
But thinking pollution.
Yeah, it's largely an empirical question. There have been some cities who have discovered that their buses in particular, now there's obviously a difference between buses and like a metro system, but the buses in general tend to be net loss in terms of pollution because they don't have particularly high ridership even when there wasn't ride sharing. And so there have been some cities that have experimented with getting rid of their bus system and letting ride sharing take care of it. And I think the jury is still out on whether or not that has been a net gain or a net loss in terms of pollution. But you're right, it is a concern that we would have to consider it, but I think it's an empirical question that we just don't have enough data to answer yet. And it may be, if Elon Musk is successful and we all have electric cars in the future, that may be better than any public transportation. And if they're self-driving, then...
Well, there are other externalities besides pollution, but...
Right.
Fair enough, but.
Yeah, and in each of the externality questions, right, is an empirical question, and they should be considered, right? Now, whether you want to consider them in a Pigouvian sense or in a Coasian sense is a separate question, but they should be considered because they are real costs on society.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the baseload concept, because I'm curious about how this works in markets that aren't more dense. So if Uber and Lyft are largely non-existent in rural Ohio counties right now, there might be 2 people driving for Uber in all of Ashtabula County. If the hypothesis is that taxi companies are going to take the base load of taking people to hospitals, of working to supplement public transportation, how does the taxi company fund the base load surplus of serving those neighborhoods, right? Isn't there a common carrier sort of problem here? That one of the reasons why we don't completely deregulate electricity is we want everybody to have the right to turn on the lights.
Exactly.
Uber works on a profit basis, so it's not terribly profitable to take poor people to the grocery store, and therefore I'd expect Uber to not enter that market. And since the taxi company is losing its monopoly profit, it doesn't have sufficient supply to satisfy the baseload for those folks.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a correct concern. The question is whether or not that solving that concern or that concern it requires us to maintain the current regulations or if there's a better regulatory scheme. Because it seems like there are a number of ways we could deal with that, right? You could have the taxi companies being largely deregulated, but then funded, having a subsidy for particular types of ride. And so they only have to, for particular types of ride, there's taxpayer funding in order to cover that, right? Which is effectively what we do, it's more complicated than that, but in energy markets, right? There are, the public interest is wrapped up in base load, and we have, single providers for large swaths of the country because it's just not profitable to have perfect competition in the rural market, and you'd expect that a lot of rural markets would end up with no power. But that doesn't mean we regulate the power power companies the same way we currently regulate taxi companies. And actually individual states, right, deal with power generation in entirely different ways. Right? Some states have a monopoly on transmission lines. In fact, isn't Ohio, you can buy your power from whoever you want? Yeah, I recall that from when I lived in Medina. Right? In Georgia, it's gas, so you can buy gas from whoever you want. But the transmission lines are regulated as a monopoly. And that would be the kind of targeted, specific regulation. If that is a problem, then we put together a targeted regulation that doesn't further entrench the industry incumbents, but still gets at the problem. Right? I don't have answers.
I mean, my problem with that is it's sort of hand waves. So, well, the government will, there will be a political consensus to pass subsidies for low-income taxi drivers. Next problem. That just seems to not be an accurate reflection of the current political climate much of anywhere.
I think that, yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I think if that is a legitimate concern, and I think it probably is, but I think that the answer to that is, well, then we need to begin identifying the solution to that now. We don't have to wait until there's no one to take, Bill or Judith to the store when they can't afford it. We don't have to wait until that's a crisis. We could begin to identify that now. The question is whether or not we impede innovation until we have a solution. And I understand it's really tempting to say that, that's the only way we'll ever get a solution is if we tell ride-sharing companies they've got to come up with something before they can have free reign on the marketplace. I don't know for sure that will be the outcome. It's a probable outcome. I don't even know whether it's a likely outcome. It's worth some research. But if it's not a likely outcome, it's possible that the market may figure something out, right? Especially if transaction costs are low.
So on this point of subsidies, but from a somewhat different angle. Now, so correct me if I'm wrong here, these numbers are a couple of years old, but Uber is itself subsidizing the cost of the services that it provides consumers, right? It's burning $2 billion a year in cash to make sure that consumers are actually only covering, I don't know, somewhere around 50% of the true cost.
I think it's a little less now, but I think you're still right that there's still